There are moments in the bold and the beautiful when the emotional weight of a storyline does not come from scandal or betrayal alone, but from something quieter, something far more intimate and devastating. The slow realization that a dream you have built your entire future around may never come true. And for Daphne Rose Walton, that realization does not arrive all at once, but unfolds over months of hope, disappointment, denial, and silent fear, until it finally reaches a point where it can no longer be ignored. And when it does, it changes everything about the way she sees herself, her relationship, and the life she thought she was moving toward with Carter Walton. At first, it had been something almost invisible, something easy to dismiss, a missed opportunity here, a quiet disappointment there, the kind of setbacks that couples reassure each other about, convincing themselves that time is still on their side. That patience will eventually bring them what they want. And Carter, with a steady optimism and unwavering belief in their future, becomes the emotional anchor in those early days, the one who refuses to let doubt take root. The one who speaks of family not as a possibility, but as something inevitable, something already forming just beyond reach. And for a while, Daphne allows herself to lean into that hope, to believe that the future he imagines is still within her grasp. But hope, when stretched too thin, begins to fracture. And as the months pass without change, without progress, without even a hint that things are moving in the direction they had dreamed of, the silence between expectations and reality begins to grow louder, more oppressive, until it becomes impossible to ignore. The decision to seek medical answers does not come easily for Daphne, because it represents something deeper than curiosity. It represents the willingness to confront a truth she has been trying to avoid. And when she finally steps into that sterile, clinical environment, she carries with her not just questions, but fear, the kind of fear that settles in the chest and refuses to let go, because she knows that whatever she hears next will define the future in a way she cannot undo. And when the diagnosis finally comes, it does not shatter her in a dramatic, explosive way. It breaks her quietly, internally, in a way that feels almost unreal at first, because the words do not immediately translate into emotion. They linger heavy and distant until they begin to sink in, until she understands what they mean, not just medically, but personally, emotionally, relationally. And in that moment, everything she thought she knew about her future begins to unravel. What follows is not immediate honesty, not a shared moment of vulnerability with Carter, but something far more complicated, far more human. She retreats inward, not because she does not trust him, but because she fears what this truth might do to him, to them, to the life they have been building together. And that fear becomes its own kind of prison, because the more she hides, the more isolated she becomes, the more she begins to carry this burden alone, convincing herself that she is protecting Carter from disappointment, when in reality, she is protecting herself from the possibility of seeing that disappointment reflected back at her, and that internal conflict becomes almost unbearable, because she is caught between two opposing truths: the desire to be honest and the fear of what honesty might cost her. Meanwhile, Carter continues to move forward with hope, unaware of the storm building beneath the surface, speaking of their future with a confidence that once comforted Daphne but now only deepens her anxiety. Because every time he talks about children, about the family they will have, about the life they are creating together, it feels like a reminder of what she may never be able to give him. And that gap between his expectations and her reality begins to widen, creating a tension that she cannot resolve. Because she knows that telling him the truth will not just change her life, it will change his, and she is not ready to face that shift. Not yet. Not when the fear of losing him feels just as real as the fear of never becoming the mother she once imagined she would be. And it is in that fragile, uncertain state that Daphne begins to search for answers outside of herself, outside of her relationship, reaching into Carter's past in a way that is both desperate and revealing. Because what she discovers is not just a piece of information, it is a possibility. A solution that feels both forbidden and necessary. The truth that Quinn Fuller has already had a child with Carter, a A child who exists somewhere far from the life Daphne is struggling to build, and that discovery changes everything. Because suddenly the future she thought was slipping away feels reachable again, not through her own body, not through the path she had envisioned, but through a different, more complicated route. One that requires confronting a past she does not fully understand, and a woman who represents everything she fears becoming irrelevant, replaced, unable to hold on to the man she loves. The decision to leave town is not impulsive. It is the result of mounting desperation, a quiet but determined choice to take control of a situation that feels increasingly out of her hands. And as she travels to find Quinn, she carries with her a mixture of hope and dread. Because she knows that what she is about to ask is not simple. It is not even entirely fair, but it feels necessary. And when she finally stands before Quinn, there is no easy way to begin, no gentle way to frame the request, because at its core, it is a plea, a deeply personal, deeply vulnerable plea for something that cannot be given without consequence. Daphne does not approach Quinn as an adversary, at least not at first. She approaches her as a woman who understands love, who understands what it means to want something so deeply that you are willing to do almost anything to protect it. And she speaks from that place, explaining her situation, her diagnosis, her fears, and ultimately her request that Quinn allow the child to return to Carter, to become part of the life he is building now, to give Daphne and Carter a chance at the family they have been dreaming of. And in that moment, everything feels suspended. Because the outcome of this conversation will determine not just the direction of Daphne's life, but the emotional balance of multiple lives intertwined in ways that cannot be easily untangled. Quinn's response, however, does not align with Daphne's hopes, because Quinn is not simply a figure from Carter's past. She is a woman with her own history, her own attachment to the child, her own understanding of what it means to be a mother, and the idea of giving up that child, of allowing someone else to step into that role, is not something she can accept, no matter how sympathetic Daphne's situation may be. And that refusal is not cruel. It is rooted in something deeply human, the instinct to protect what is yours, to hold on to the one connection that defines you in a way nothing else can. And in that moment, the conflict shifts from a question of possibility to a confrontation of competing truths, both valid, both painful, both impossible to reconcile without loss. And yet, Quinn's refusal does not end the story. It transforms it, because her decision to return to town introduces a new layer of tension, one that will ripple through Carter's life, Daphne's fragile emotional state, and the already complex dynamics of the world they inhabit. And as Quinn prepares to step back into that world, she does so not as a passive figure, but as someone who understands the impact of her presence, someone who knows that her return will force conversations that have been avoided, truths that have been hidden, and emotions that have been carefully contained. And that awareness gives her a quiet strength, a sense of control that contrasts sharply with Daphne's growing sense of instability. For Daphne, the journey back from that encounter is not just physical. It is emotional, because she's returning not only without the solution she hoped for, but with the knowledge that her secret cannot remain hidden much longer, that the truth about her fertility, about her fears, about her actions, will inevitably come to light. And when it does, she will have to face Carter not as the woman he believes her to be, but as the woman she has been struggling to accept herself. And that confrontation, when it comes, will not be simple, it will not be clean, it will be messy, emotional, and deeply revealing, because it will force both of them to confront not only what they want, but what they are willing to endure to stay together. And perhaps that is the most compelling aspect of this storyline, the way it moves beyond surface-level drama into something more profound, the exploration of identity, of expectation, of the roles we believe we are meant to fulfill, and the pain that comes when we cannot. And as everything continues to unfold, I find myself less interested in whether Daphne and Carter will find a way to build the family they dreamed of, and more interested in how they will redefine themselves in the face of this challenge. Because sometimes the most powerful stories are not about getting what we want, but about learning who we are when we cannot. And whether that realization will bring them closer together or push them apart is a question that remains unanswered, lingering in the space between hope and reality, where all the most meaningful conflicts in the bold and the beautiful are born. The moment Daphne returns to Los Angeles, something inside her has already changed, and that change is not loud or visible at first, but it lingers in the way she walks into a room, in the way she looks at Carter Walton as if she is seeing him from a distance she cannot close. Because what she carries now is not just disappointment, it is knowledge, and knowledge has a way of reshaping love into something more fragile, more uncertain, more easily broken if handled the wrong way. She had left town believing that she could fix everything quietly, that she could solve the problem without forcing Carter to confront it, without forcing their relationship to stand in the harsh light of reality. But instead, she returns empty-handed, carrying not only the weight of her diagnosis, but the added burden of rejection from Quinn Fuller. And that double failure begins to press down on her in a way she can no longer ignore. At first, Daphne tries to act as though nothing has changed, slipping back into her life beside Carter with a practiced calm, responding to his warmth with careful smiles, allowing his optimism to fill the space between them even as it quietly suffocates her from the inside. Because every hopeful word he speaks now lands differently, every mention of the future feels like a reminder of the truth she is still hiding, and the more she tries to maintain the illusion, the more it begins to crack, not in obvious ways, but in subtle hesitations. In moments where her responses arrive just a second too late, in the quiet distance that begins to grow between what she feels and what she allows herself to show. Carter, perceptive in his own steady way, begins to notice that distance, though he cannot yet name it. And his instinct is not suspicion, but concern, because the man he is has always been someone who leans toward understanding rather than accusation. And so he tries to close the gap in the only way he knows how, by offering more support, more reassurance, more belief in the life they are building together. And in doing so, he unknowingly intensifies Daphne's internal conflict, because his kindness makes the truth harder to speak, not easier. It raises the stakes, deepens the fear, and makes her wonder whether telling him everything will not just change their future, but shatter the present they are still holding on to. But secrets in a place like this do not stay buried for long, especially not when they're tied to something as fundamental as identity and family. And the ripple effect of Daphne's journey begins to move outward in ways she cannot control. Because Quinn, having made her decision, does not remain distant. She returns, not quietly, not cautiously, but with the kind of presence that demands attention. Because Quinn does not do anything halfway, and her arrival alone is enough to shift the emotional balance of everyone connected to Carter, whether they realize it immediately or not. When Carter learns that Quinn is back, the reaction is not simple, not clean, because his history with her is not something that can be neatly categorized as past or resolved. It is layered with memory, with unresolved feeling, with the knowledge that something real existed there, even if it could not last. And now that she is back, and now that Daphne has already crossed paths with her, the emotional lines between past and present begin to blur in ways that make everything more complicated, more volatile, and more difficult to navigate without consequences. The inevitable confrontation between Daphne and Carter does not happen all at once, but it builds slowly, through small fractures in their communication, through moments where silence says more than words ever could, until finally the weight of everything she has been carrying becomes too much. And the truth begins to surface, not as a carefully planned confession, but as something raw, something imperfect, something that comes out in pieces because she no longer has the strength to hold it all together. When she finally tells him about the diagnosis, about the fear, about the reason she left, and the truth she tried to hide, it does not land in the way she expected, because Carter does not react with disappointment or anger, not immediately. Instead, he listens. And that listening becomes its own kind of tension, because it forces Daphne to sit in the reality of what she has said without being able to immediately interpret his response. And when he does speak, it is not to judge her, but to understand why she felt she had to face this alone. Why she did not trust him enough to share the burden from the beginning. And that is where the deeper conflict reveals itself. Because for Carter, the issue is no longer just about whether they can have children. It is about trust, about partnership, about whether the life they're building together is truly shared or whether it is something each of them is trying to manage separately. And for Daphne, that realization is almost as painful as the diagnosis itself, because she begins to understand that in trying to protect their future, she may have damaged the very foundation it was built on. But the most explosive part of the truth has not yet been revealed, because Daphne cannot stop at the diagnosis. She cannot stop at the fear. She has to tell him about Quinn, about the child, about the decision she made to seek her out and ask for something that was never hers to claim. And when that truth comes out, it shifts everything again, because now Carter is not just processing Daphne's pain. He is forced to confront his own past in a way that is no longer abstract, no longer distant, but immediate and deeply personal. The idea that he has a child, a living connection to a past relationship that is now standing just outside the life he is trying to build, is something that cannot be easily absorbed. And the fact that Daphne knew that she acted on that knowledge without telling him adds another layer of complexity that neither of them is fully prepared to handle, because it raises questions that go beyond love and into identity, into responsibility, into the kind of man Carter wants to be moving forward. And as Quinn steps back into their world, the tension between all three of them begins to tighten, because she is no longer just a memory or a possibility. She is a presence, a force that brings with her not only the truth of what was, but the potential of what could still be. And that presence threatens to unravel everything Daphne and Carter have been trying to hold together, not because Quinn is actively trying to destroy it, but because her existence alone forces them to confront realities they can no longer avoid. Daphne, standing at the center of all of this, begins to face a different kind of fear, not just the fear of losing Carter because of her inability to give him a child, but the fear of losing him because of everything she has done in response to that fear, the secrecy, the choices, the attempt to control a situation that was never fully hers to control. And that realization brings her to a place where she must make a decision not about the future she imagined, but about the person she wants to be when everything falls apart. Because that is what this story becomes, not just a question of whether they can build a family, but a question of whether they can rebuild trust, whether they can face the truth together instead of apart, whether they can accept that love does not always follow the path they planned and still choose to hold on to it anyway. And as the lines between past and present continue to blur, and as the presence of Quinn grows more impossible to ignore, the future of this relationship hangs in a fragile balance, one that could tip in any direction depending on the choices they make next. And in a world where nothing stays hidden for long, where every secret eventually finds its way into the light, the real question is no longer what has been revealed, but what will be done with that truth now that it is finally out in the open. Because in the bold and the beautiful, the truth does not end a story.